In this session, we had a very close examination on what data synthesis entails in writing a systematic review. So I want you to actually take out your time and enjoy this series. Let's go.
So in this episode, we're going to session today. We're going to be looking at introduction to data synthesis for systematic reviews, and we're going to look at some of the various quantitative and qualitative approaches one could actually embark on while performing your data synthesis. And it's going to be, this introduction is going to lay a foundation for people who are systematic reviewers or aspirants of research, and you're having that dedication of performing very robust evidence that can inform practice. You remember that data synthesis is also another essential element of the systematic review component, because data synthesis is solely the part where we get to show what we've combined from all these multiple evidence. So I'm going to be a facilitator for today. So before we commence, as usual, we'll have an outline that we'll be discussing. First of all, we'll be talking about, we need to understand what data synthesis means, and then I'm going to shed more light on quantitative synthesis, which is one aspect of data synthesis. Then we'll look at some of the advantages and limitations of meta-analysis, which is one of the fundamental parts of the quantitative synthesis. Then we'll look at qualitative synthesis, and we'll also take a look at the advantages and limitations of narrative synthesis, which is part of one element of quantitative. Then the same thing is also going to apply for the thematic synthesis, where we'll look at some of the advantages and limitations as well. Then we need to now take a look at, when do we know when to choose the right model? When do we know when to choose either of the synthesis approaches that we've just looked at, and also have a summary of the keywords, of the key points, and then practice exercises. So this is how we're going to lay out our conversation on data synthesis for today. So let's get right going. Now, one question we need to always ask ourselves is, what is data synthesis? Let's say you've started your systematic review and you're looking at the checklist from any particular framework. And one element of this checklist is always you've got your introduction, you've got to write your, lots of areas. One element that you always found very unique in all of them is the data synthesis. So when you take a look at the Prisma checklist, which is a widely used checklist in performing a systematic review or any sort of a review that happens to be of imperative, very good importance to us, we always find out that data synthesis is a very, very pertinent aspect of this checklist. And what data synthesis entails is that it's all about combining results from multiple studies. Remember that the idea for us to do a systematic review is that we want to pick evidence from distinct primary studies or unique primary studies and combine them together so that we can now come up with our own secondary conclusion or overall conclusion or summary of our findings. So what is the approach of data synthesis now is that we're reading all those papers, primary papers, we're picking information from them one after the other, and we now use it to draw conclusion on what we are interested in. That is just what data synthesis is all about. So we just want to draw conclusions across those multiple papers that we have on board. So this is just like the example we are working on. Now we are trying to look at the determinants of teenage pregnancy in sub-Saharan Africa. So it means that if we want to perform a quantitative or a qualitative synthesis, that means from those three papers that we've included earlier on, we can now go to the findings or the results of those papers and pick out information. It might not just only be in the findings, it might also be in other areas of the papers pick up findings across those three papers and summarize them. That is what data synthesis is all about. Then we can now be able to come up with an overall conclusion that we've observed while going through some of these papers. So it's also applicable to any other type of, research question that you come up with. And some of the two main approaches here is the quantitative and qualitative. When we talk about quantitative synthesis, we are talking about a meta-analysis, right? So there are also other quantitative approaches that you might use, but maybe it can be network meta-analysis and all that. But the idea here is that whenever we are dealing with quantitative, it's all about numbers. So we're trying to pick up numeric characteristics out of those studies that we find of interest, so that we can be able to do draw a reasonable conclusion. So we also, in our future episode, we're going to also have a detailed look of what a meta-analysis is going to seem to be, so that we can always know what we are talking about. So for the qualitative aspect of it, we have various methods that we use. We have the narrative synthesis, we have the thematic synthesis, as well as others. We also got the content analysis and a wide array of them. So these are all tailored to the fact that for us to perform a qualitative synthesis, we're trying to draw inference from what the heterogeneous aspects of it. So we have a look at what this qualitative synthesis means in our future episode. Remember that the idea is that in quantitative, we're looking at numbers, whereas in qualitative, there are distinct characteristics that are not numerical that we are trying to summarize across the papers. So these are the two main approaches that we use in performing our systematic review. Now, let's have a clearer look at what the quantitative synthesis means, or what the meta-analysis means at this stage. Now, so you can always imagine having a ball, or let's say, for example, you're embarking on a study like, let's say, prevalence of HIV and AIDS in Nigeria, for example. For you to get the prevalence of HIV and AIDS in Nigeria, these are numerical data where one primary study can say 50%, another one can say 3.01 prevalence, or some can use frequency, or some can use percentages, diverse numerical approaches in quantifying, the prevalence. But what are we trying to say is that the definition of a quantitative synthesis now, for this example that I've given now, is that a statistical method is used to combine data from these various studies, so we can actually get the overall effect. So in this idea now, for us to have 50% here of prevalence, 30%, 3.01, these are all numerical attributes that we can use the statistical approach to now combine across all the states in Nigeria to now get the overall effect, or the pooled effect of, or the pooled, the pooled data of what HIV in Nigeria. So that's an example. So we use them when we have similar designs or interventions. So mostly, now we're going to be explaining our meta-analysis in practical terms. We are going to be understanding that we use the meta-analysis when you have similar design. Example, let's say with the studies we're looking at are all cross-sectional studies. So that means it will be easier for us to all pull up, data across all the cross-sectional studies, which we have in our design as our intervention. Also, we have certain outcome measures that we're interested in, or we have certain interventions that we're interested in, and they are all similar across the studies. That means a meta-analysis is going to be It's going to be very appropriate. So we're going to look at some examples, some visual examples in this introductory session to data synthesis also. So what are the steps whenever we want to conduct a meta-analysis or a quantitative synthesis? First thing, which is uniform across all the studies, is that we need to extract the data, right? So we need to extract the data. We need to gather numerical data on the effect sizes, and then we need to pool the data, because whenever we've pooled them, the next thing now is to now summarize them, right? So we pool the data, and we calculate the summary effect. It's also another thing, because most times we also, when we explain about meta-analysis, we're talking about some of the effect measures, where we have the random effect and fixed effect. And also, it's also very important for us to understand how to assess for heterogeneity. How do we assess for heterogeneity? Is to check if there are differences, if the studies are consistent. And one of the measures for this is what we know as the I squared test or I squared statistic, where sometimes we can actually have a cutoff point for our I squared test, where we say if I squared is cut off at 50%, then it means that if I squared is cut off, if I squared is greater than 50%, then it means that the study is very heterogeneous. But if I squared is less than 50%, that's that the studies they are showing significant homogeneity. So these are other things we're going to have, to look at in details in our episode. And also, we understand that an example of this is just like comparing results from clinical trials to assess the effectiveness of a new drug in reducing blood pressure. So it also applies to the same example I gave, prevalence, because sometimes meta-analysis is not always for an effect of intervention. You can also perform that for a descriptive, data like prevalence or an ecological study. So these are some of the information we need to know. So what's our take-home point here for quantitative synthesis is that, it's whenever we are doing a study or we're trying to conduct any type of systematic review, whereby our included studies are looking at numerical outcomes and they have similar design and a similar intervention in the sense of an effect of intervention studies. So that is where a meta-analysis is going to be appropriate for us to combine data from various studies. Remember that the idea for us to perform the meta-analysis is that what we are trying to do, combine numerical data together from various studies. So what are some of the advantages and limitations of the meta-analysis, from this point? Some of the advantages is that a meta-analysis increases, the power and precision. It's always very important because when we perform a meta-analysis, we can always do what? Summarize that, okay, this is the precision, this is the point for us to ascertain for our evidence. And our gain is that it's going to provide a more reliable effect estimate, unlike another type of data synthesis where there are a lot of variations in how the outcomes are being measured. So we still get to explain this in details with examples. And also it can also identify trends that are not apparent to individual studies because we are trying to combine data from several studies. So it's easier for us to see the trends. Just like if you look at this picture here, you can actually say, okay, these are some of the points, for these point measures. And it's very easier compared to when we are doing any other form of synthesis that is not, numerical. And some of the limitations of performing a meta-analysis is that the studies have to be similar. So it requires similar studies for accuracy. So it means that if you want to perform a meta-analysis, it just has to be similar, because if we don't have similar outcomes, it's going to be very difficult for us to perform a meta-analysis, right? And this is what makes it now susceptible to publication bias, because it will now lead us to choosing certain publications that we're interested in, right? So that's what publication bias is all about in a layman's view. That we're now going to now focus on a certain, data or certain publication that we'll only be interested in because of the type of outcomes. So meaning that if other studies now are reporting other things, we might now have to exclude them because of what? That bias, and because of that, the limitation that it has in what? That the process requires us to show similar outcomes. So that's going to really influence our decision and our choice. So if there is high heterogeneity, that means if there are so much differences among the studies, the findings can be misleading. So these are some of the limitations that we have in meta-analysis. And most times that is why when we are seeing all these limitations, we might decide to opt for another approach, maybe such as narrative synthesis and all that, to summarize the data, unlike using a numerical estimate like a meta-analysis. So these are some of the limitations and some of the potential strengths or advantages that we just highlighted here for meta-analysis. Remember that in terms of our advantages, it increases power and precision, and it also provides a more reliable effect estimate. Maybe if it's a fixed or random effect, and it can identify trends most times, which is not even apparent to the individual in an individual study. And for the limitations of the meta-analysis, it requires similar studies. For accuracy, we need the studies to be more similar, and it's very susceptible to publication bias because of how we make choices. We can always overlook some, more important studies because of what we're looking for, and it can be misleading if there is what high heterogeneity, very variation among the studies. So now let's look at another type of study design, which we identify to be the what narrative synthesis. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the narrative synthesis, it takes a more qualitative approach, in the sense that here we are trying to summarize findings from studies without pulling them statistically, and most times we use it when the meta-analysis is not possible. We can now bring in the narrative synthesis, because here we want to now pull diverse studies in terms of design, interventions, and outcomes. So, there are diverse designs and diverse outcomes. So, instead of falling into publication bias, we can use a narrative synthesis to compensate for that. And some of the components of a narrative synthesis is that, of performing it, is that, first of all, the next thing we need to do is to just develop a preliminary synthesis. We need to provide a summary of each of these studies, and we'll try to look at some of the relationship between those studies, in the data, and then we can now assess for robustness as the quality of the included studies, right? So it's just going to be similar to the next approach, because here we are interested in doing what, summarizing those studies without really getting trapped with, we're just being limited to publication bias. An example here is, let's say we are doing a systematic review of factors influencing patient satisfaction with healthcare services. So we just have to do or summarize the themes across these studies, some of the studies, or we have to open up all those studies and check out some of the things that are similar among them and extract them and do a synthesis. So narrative synthesis is an approach that we're going to be using severally in our systematic review most times, because of how much it can accommodate both qualitative and quantitative data. So let's say you're doing a study that now has diverse designs, right, or diverse outcomes, and you want to accommodate both the numerical and the quantitative and the qualitative, or maybe the numerical and the categorical data and all that, right? So narrative synthesis is going to be very, very appropriate. That shows so much understanding. And looking at the advantages and disadvantages or limitations, we can say that for the narrative synthesis, just like we said, it allows a broader range of studies to be included, right? So you can include you can include both some of the included quantitative and included qualitative studies, because it's mostly useful maybe whenever we're trying to explore complex topics with varied study designs. Just like we looked at in patient satisfaction, and the patient satisfaction can be measured using various approaches. Some can be measured using numerical for patient satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10. Some can be measured using quantitative measures like moderate, satisfied, not satisfied, and all that. So in that situation now, with those diverse various outcomes, you can always synthesize them together. And in terms of the limitations, it's not really objective like the meta-analysis, which is very quantitative, and sometimes it can lack rigor because it's not systematically conducted, and it has all the potentials for subjective interpretation, because in this scenario now, you're textualizing it. Remember that the narrative synthesis is more textualized. You're textualizing the findings, and there is that possibility of you bringing in bias, because of what you're reporting. And these are some of the disadvantages or limitations of narrative synthesis. So let's look at the thematic synthesis, which is also another approach. So a thematic synthesis is defined as, so it's similar to the narrative, but in this scenario now, we're interested in the identification of themes. So sometimes both can be used interchangeably, but you can always remember the qualitative approach you use in your primary studies, performing your interviews. It's not different from your thematic synthesis. where you usually perform it for qualitative research. Maybe most of your included studies are all qualitative research. And some of the steps there could be just maybe you start by coding the data, checking recurrent themes across each of those included studies. You now develop a group of codes, related codes, broader themes, and analyze them to come up with some of your themes. And then you're able to write up your synthesis. So similar to the narrative synthesis, but in the symptomatic synthesis, it focuses mostly on qualitative studies, whereas the narrative most times can actually combine various approaches. Right? So you don't have to be confusing the word themes, but here it's mathematically largely for qualitative studies where you can actually even make quotes while discussing. And an example is most times when we are looking at studies that are exploring experiences, and perspectives, and when there are qualitative designs, we use a thematic synthesis to synthesize our studies. So some of the advantages is that, for thematic synthesis here, it captures complex experience and perspective, just like I said. It provides rich understanding of the themes across the studies, and also provides enough rich quantitative information. These are some of the things we look at there because, when you're exploring experience, you're trying to get detailed insights from that study that you're performing. So just think about the thematic synthesis about, let's say you're trying to explore experiences of women towards use of ancestral care services. And you have about 10 studies in Nigeria you want to include. So you want to just go through those studies, capture some of the information in their results, code them together, analyze them into teams, and report them and start writing. So it's one limitation is that you always need top-notch skill to use quantitative tools like in vivo and other, right? So it requires skills in quantitative analysis. Sometimes it's time consuming because you get to start coding all those information across those included studies, and it can bring in bias like subjective interpretations, and also it has that limited ability to generalize findings because a qualitative study always has that. That's one of the limitations of a qualitative study generally, because whenever you're doing a qualitative study, you cannot just generalize because it's just from a particular group of people. So that is that. So we will have a look at some of our. I'm going to have a look at some examples of what the meta-analysis looks like. So if we look at this paper that was published this paper was published, through my collaboration with some of the academics international on prevalence of antibiotic resistance in older adults. We performed a systematic review and meta-analysis. So this is what a meta-analysis looks like. Coming to the paper, you have your risk of bias, your quality assessment, you have the characteristics of included studies, and data synthesis, quality assessment. Now, in your Prisma, you have 6 studies included in the review, and you have 6 included in the meta-analysis. And this is where you need to see the characteristics of the included studies, and this is what the meta-analysis forest plot looks like. So this is where we now do what? Perform our synthesis, by combining the estimates, across some of those studies, where we included 6 studies by Bello, the study by Everland, the study by Fabrice, the study by Washio, Weber, and Vienna in 1999. And these are some of the effect measures, and this is the overall effect, where it is trying to report that we are trying to demonstrate the overall good effect of antibiotic resistance among older adults. and adults with Alzheimer's disease. So this is what a meta-analysis looks like in the results of a meta-analysis. So I'm also going to quickly show us also what the narrative synthesis example looks like. So this is also another publication that we had. This was published in cardiovascular research journal, cardiology and vascular research journal, where we look at the correlative study on body mass index and blood pressure in the United Kingdom. So if you look at the synthesis of this study, so you can actually check out the paper out there. You're going to find out that there is no forest plot here. So technically, we qualitized the findings. We use the narrative synthesis. So if you come to the method of data synthesis here for this study, we use the narrative synthesis. So this is what a narrative synthesis of, and looks like when we textualize the findings across the study. Remember, we said here we summarized all the findings across the paper, and we do what? After summarizing that, we now get to discuss the findings. Okay. So now this is for this. I'm also going to show us another example of what a thematic synthesis looks like at this stage. Remember, we're just trying to basically show the examples. In our next meeting, we're now going to discuss in details what this looks like. So this is a structured qualitative literature review where we explore the experiences and treatment-seeking behavior of women suffering from postpartum depression in the United States. So let's look at what the study. If you take a look at the abstract here, you see clearly here you have the aim, you have the background, and you have the methods. And clearly in the method, we have said that a thematic synthesis was employed. That's worthy to note. And when we go inside of the paper, so this is what it looks like. Coming to your data synthesis, here it was clearly written. So this is it. Yeah. Okay, so all right. So this is what it looks like. So our result, we provided the criteria of the included studies. Well, we have the table summarizing the findings, and we've done the methodological assessment. And going down, we now look at the thematic synthesis, right? So the first thing we do in the thematic synthesis is we start by explaining some of the stages. Remember, we talked about that, coding the data. We did mention that, if you can remember. Creating descriptive teams, we did mention that. And constructing the analytical team. So these are all the things that we did in order to do what? Get going. So at the end of the day, we were able to come up with 3 things, which is experiences of mental utilization on this second, third, and fourth. So four things. So these are these. So when we now start explaining all that we have captured across the studies, for the 4 studies, and so while we are writing, also we are putting some of what we've captured from these studies in our text. So this is exactly what our thematic synthesis entails. All right, so that is going to be that for now, and we have also had a clear-cut understanding on that. So now, where do we choose the right model or the right synthesis approach? Now, choosing the right synthesis approach is something that is very important. So most times, for you to choose meta-analysis, it's usually best whenever you're conducting a quantitative data with consistent outcomes. So anytime you're doing an effect of drug intervention, you can use thematic or narrative synthesis for that. It's very imperative for you to report the best evidence you need what? A very objective approach, which is the what? Meta-analysis. Meta-analysis being very objective makes it very, 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 very important for you to do what? To perform your what? Your, your quantitative data synthesis. Particularly for what? For drug interventions or drug comparison, whichever type of efficacy test that you want to do, the meta-analysis is very important. So narrative is usually useful whenever when we are using mixed methods or heterogeneous studies, right? So, example, interventions for mental health, these are several designs. So let's see narrative as mixed method, maybe at the stage. So in that situation, we need what? To use a narrative synthesis. Whereas for mathematics is ideal when it's all qualitative, right? Focus on experience or perspective. So that is where we need to do what? Focus when all our ingredient studies are all qualitative. So it's very, very important for us to use the words. Instead of using a narrative synthesis, we can just use a thematic synthesis, and it will make a lot of sense for us. So, in a nutshell, all you need to know is that for quantitative synthesis, it's all about statistical compilation of some of our study results, and all we've talked about here also in summary is that for narrative synthesis, we need to summarize diverse studies without statistical analysis. Thematic synthesis, it's all about identifying key themes, for in-depth insight. So remember that for you, we're starting your meta synthesis for a systematic review. Choosing that right approach is whenever you've got your hands on the type of study design, you've got the data type, which could be seen as the outcome, and the type of review question or objective. Remember that your research question plays a very paramount role on the type of synthesis that you need to. So we've got a couple of exercises just to perform. So you need to choose a couple of journals and articles here. Start with your systematic review synthesis. Is very important. And in our next session, we're going to be having a very detailed look on meta-analysis and how to get started with your meta-analysis. So it's a pleasure to have each and every one of you into this session, and I wish you guys the very best. So just to give you a rundown again of all that we've talked about today, we started by talking about data synthesis. We talked about quantitative synthesis, qualitative, thematic, and how to choose the right approach. And we saw data synthesis as just combining results from multiple studies to provide a summary of the findings. And we said that some of the two main approaches are quantitative and qualitative. Whereas for quantitative, it's method analysis, qualitative is thematic and narrative synthesis. And we said that for quantitative synthesis, meta-analysis, whenever we want to take studies from, we have similar outcomes. All these things have actually been explained. And we have similar designs, whereas for some of the advantages and limitations are all the precision for advantages, more reliable effect estimate, which provides that trends, and there's susceptibility of bias, we need that similar studies, for accuracy, and it can be misleading if there is high heterogeneity. All these accounts for the limitations. And for qualitative, whenever we have a narrative synthesis, mostly mixed method approach, we will have diverse designs. It's very important. And the advantage is that it takes broader approaches, and we use it mostly whenever we're exploring complex topics. And again, it could have that limitation of less objectivity and lacks sometimes rigor and maybe potentials for subjective interpretation. And this is also something that is very synonymous or very similar with the thematic synthesis being subjective. But here we choose it if it's mostly for qualitative studies designs that we've got, and that's also going to make it capture rich information on the experiences or detailed insights. And some limitations of thematic synthesis is that you need skills for your work for performing it, and again it's time consuming. We can't always generalize the findings. So these are when we need to choose. Again, we said whenever it's quantitative, and anytime you're doing a clinical trial test, you've got prevalence studies, meta-analysis is very appropriate. Narrative is always more useful when we are using mixed method studies, and if it's qualitative, study design is entirely you need a thematic synthesis. And these are some of our key points. So, pleasure to have you guys. See you guys in our next session. Where we'll be talking about something very spectacular, choosing our next data synthesis method, which is a quantitative approach. So it's a pleasure to have each and every one of you once more. So thank you for your time, and bye-bye.